All right, hello, welcome everybody. I am Christine Champion, and I am the head of marketing here at Authentic ID. For those of you who are not familiar with Authentic ID, I'll give you a little bit of background. So we are an identity verification and fraud prevention technology provider. So basically, we allow businesses to authenticate identities and ensure that people are who they're claiming to be. So today we are going to dig into our 2024 State of Identity Fraud Report, and I have two esteemed identity experts here with me on the call, Blair Cohen, who is the president and founder of Authentic ID, as well as Steve Craig, who is the founder and Chief Enablement Officer at PEAK IDV. So welcome, you guys. Good morning, good afternoon. I know you're on opposite sides of the country. If you want to take a minute to give your own introductions and a little background on your experience in this space.
Steve, you're at the top. You go first.
All right, I'm happy to start. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I'm Steve Craig, founder and Chief Enablement Officer at PEAK IDV. I've been in the digital identity industry for nearly 10 years, working in roles in product strategy, commercial roles. I worked at various solution providers. I started PEAK IDV to become a community-powered learning hub for digital identity knowledge. And our mission is to enable 10,000 people or more to become experts in these topics in identity verification, biometrics, fraud prevention, and more. We partner with companies like Authentic ID, with practitioners of these technologies and investors to help them keep pace with the dynamic changes in the market. So I'm happy to be here. Maybe on to you next, Blair.
First of all, I want to thank Christine and her team for preparing this amazing report. There's some enlightening facts that we're excited to share with everybody today. To give you a little bit of a brief on who I am, Blair Cohen, I'm the founder and president here at Authentic ID. But prior to Authentic ID, I also founded another company called Infomart. So I've effectively been in the identity space for, I don't know, I'm dating myself here, but like 34 years. So I've seen a lot of changes over the past 34 years. But the changes that have occurred between last year and this year alone are pretty astounding. So let's get on with it.
So a couple housekeeping items before we get started. We're going to have Q&A at the end of the session. So if anybody has questions along the way, you can enter them in. There's a button on the right-hand side that says questions. And then also after the event, we're going to be sending a recording of the webinar as well as a copy of this fraud report that we're going to go through today. So let's start and talk about identity fraud trends that are on the rise. I do want to give the audience the opportunity to chime in and enter a poll question and tell us what type of fraud are you seeing in your businesses in the past year going into 2024. And then while our audience enters their responses in, Steve and Blair, you can take it away and you can kind of answer that same question.
Steve, we'll continue the order. You go first here.
All right. Well, we've seen massive changes in how people interact online in a post-pandemic world. So more and more people are using the digital channels to interact. And that means that fraud is able to take advantage. So fraud trends have been exploding, not just in what we classically think of as impersonation or identity theft, but also in synthetic identity attacks, where the perpetrator is taking mixes of data, compiling that, and then completely making up the identity to onboard in your channel and to attack you in that way. What are some of the other trends you're seeing, Blair?
Well, I just want to double click on synthetic a little bit. We've got some amazing stats here on the slide. I mean, in 85% of all identity fraud that our enterprises saw last year were synthetics. This is a big turnaround. That wasn't the case 3 or 4 years ago. It was mostly third-party fraud. So to see a dramatic rise in 85% seeing synthetic abuse and synthetic identity fraud get through is pretty alarming because it's a very difficult problem to stop. And 47% of all businesses reported, synthetic identity fraud. But to double click on some of the additional challenges that we're seeing, I think the one that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room that's front and center of everybody's mind today is generative AI. So we absolutely have seen a big uptick in generative AI attacks. Push payment fraud has really just skyrocketed like crazy with romance scams. And we're seeing just a ton more fake IDs, and they're getting a lot more sophisticated. Some interesting stats on this page. We're seeing some differences and some techniques that people are modifying and changing. It used to be that we didn't see that many fraudulent biometrics. People weren't that bold. I think part of that is fraudsters, it's a deterrent for them to offer up their real face. They really don't want to do it. They'll offer up fake IDs all day long, but put their real face behind the camera, that's bold. And it's something most of them have in the past not really wanted to do. But a good 10% increase between 2022 and 23. Headshot manipulations, we still see a lot of that. And this is where somebody takes a fake ID, maybe Steve's real fake ID, but they're not Steve, so they can't use that ID. So they have to change the face on that document. And we're seeing slightly less of that happen this year. I probably attribute that to the fact that the tools have gotten better. We've been focusing at Authentic ID on solving this problem for the past couple of years, and we've gotten really darn good at it. And we've stopped a lot of the fraudsters, so I guess they're moving to other techniques. Big rise in material analysis. So there are plenty of websites out there. I won't name those for you folks today, but plenty of websites where you can go and get a fake ID made for nominal sums. And in most cases, the template that's being used, it has all the security features. It has all the patterns. It's from a visual standpoint, it looks identical to a genuinely issued identity document. But it's not, of course. So they have to inject that into the system in some way, shape, or form. And they're limited. So at Authentic ID, we make sure that when somebody is taking a picture of an identity document, it's a real identity document. It's not a digital facsimile of one. It's not a perfect template that's been printed out to paper and laminated. We make sure that it's really polycarbonate or Teflon. We know the substrate that those documents should be printed on, and we check for that, and you can see a pretty significant increase, about 5%. Barcode manipulation, that's one of the areas, won't give you all of our secrets, fraudsters, but you make lots of mistakes here. Even though the PDF 417 standard is public, people get this wrong often. So we definitely see lots of barcodes that are being manipulated, and we're able to stop those fraudulent documents. Even though a human would never be able to detect it, we're able to stop that kind of thing in seconds. And a pretty big decline in text tampering. Not really sure what to attribute that to. It's a little bit harder, and it's generally, probably not in our purview. I think the text tampered documents that are out there are mostly kids that are trying to change their year of birth so they can go buy alcohol. So these are where they change tiny little pieces of text that are on the document, not the name, not the full address, just tiny little pieces, and manipulate those. So, but they're absolutely getting much more sophisticated. We're seeing that most of the counterfeiters out there today, if you're looking at things like UV features or infrared features, they're there. They're there in these perfect templates. If you're looking at embossing over the name or over the document number, these people are using pretty sophisticated printers. It's not just the LaserJet printer of yesteryear. They're actually getting the Zebra printers and printing very legitimate looking ID cards that humans have absolutely no ability to detect and stop.
As you were describing all of that sophistication, Blair, it reminded me of where the fraudsters have been. So looking back just 5-10 years, they were using basic Photoshop templates, or they were just superimposing physically right on the document, in some cases using completely made up fantasy documents that don't even match any of the layouts or templates that exist. That was then, and now they've gotten much better, not just in the technology they're using, but just the accuracy of it and the photorealism that comes with it. So very interesting to see these stats.
Yes, there's been, like you guys said, there's been an explosion of these AI tools. And when we were creating this report, we actually whipped up some of these fake profile images using a free generative AI tool online. And I wanted to do a little bit of trivia with the audience. And if you guys want to enter your guess in the chat box, the first person that can get this right, we'll send a gift card to. But only one of these images here is real. The rest are fake. So if you have a guess, chime in. And like I said, you'll get a prize for it. So let's talk about some of the regulations in the AI space. And, how do you guys think? I know last year there was one that came out as it relates to generative AI in China. And of course, in Europe, we've had the AI Act that was built and brought out in December of last year. How do you think this will shape the development and adoption of these tools? Steve, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I could start because this is a very hot topic right now. We've certainly seen the progress that the European Union is making with the AI Act. In the US, we're a little bit behind with respect to AI and governance. There is, from the White House, a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that they've put out. But we continue to see these congressional sessions where they're grilling the leaders of the social media companies, or they're trying to combat disinformation, and it's only going to get worse. So I do think that companies are going to see more government intervention in the use of these technologies. How I think it's going to influence it, we already have a model for that in regulated financial institutions, model governance for credit risk scoring and for ensuring access to financial products. That already exists outside of AI. So I think that's going to be more and more of a theme. We're going to see more pressure to combat algorithmic bias. So with algorithmic bias, if you are not training these models correctly, you could exclude certain populations or flag certain individuals as fraudulent. We're seeing a lot of news about that from the retail environment, where they're using cameras to track people coming in and out of the store to catch theft. One of the big retailers in the pharmacy space was actually, they got into some trouble with FTC. And then you'll see more around the concept of like this digital redlining with the AI technologies to prevent that. Where I think this goes on the fraud side, though, is it's completely the Wild West there. They don't have to deal with regulations. They're already committing crimes. So companies that are using these technologies have to combat this explosion of these techniques from the fraudsters, knowing that they have to do so within the confines of the law, versus the fraudsters, they don't care.
Leaves us at kind of a uneven ground, doesn't it, Steve? I mean, if the fraudsters can collaborate and they're not bound by regulation, whereas all of us are, where does that go?
I think we need to see from the private industry more collaboration. We need to, it's one of the reasons why I started PEAK IDV. We need more education and awareness, because you betcha the fraudsters are sharing attack vectors when they find a weakness within an organization's onboarding or workflow. They're sharing that, and then it becomes exploited at scale. So we as a community have to work together to make sure we're staying ahead of that where we can.
I wonder how much OKX has seen a big explosion in fraud over the past few days, since it was announced that one of the websites was able to successfully breach all their controls. I don't know if you saw that one. It was interesting, the crypto exchange. We'll talk on that one more later.
Certainly.
All right, so looks like we have a trivia winner. The real person was number 4. So I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name right, Isla Goldanlo. So you'll get your gift card. All right, so let's move on to kind of fraudsters. So obviously fraudsters are working alone, but there's no shortage of these large organized crime groups that are playing a major role of fraud incidents, both domestically and abroad. So what have you guys heard about that has been making the news recently?
Well, the big one that isn't on this list is the one that just happened in Hong Kong over the past week. And this is, we don't really know if it was organized crime or not. I would tend to think so, because it was a very, very sophisticated crime. It's not that difficult for somebody to generate Steve's face and replay Steve's face, but Steve's face isn't moving in that case. We're talking about a static photo and manipulating this. But in the case that I'm talking about, this was insane. So the CFO of a company, along with many of his staff and the executive team, had traveled to London to do some sort of M&A deal. They called up somebody in the accounting, somebody with privileges within the financial department within the company, and they were in a Zoom call. And all of these Zoom calls, the people leading the call looked just like the CFO from this company, sounded just like the CFO from the company, and had multiple other people that were from the executive team of this company that looked and sounded exactly like they normally do. So needless to say, the person in the finance department was convinced that he was legitimately being ordered to wire $25 million to what turns out to be a bogus account. That one astounds me. I've seen a lot. We've seen Scattered Spider and Gamble Force and Charming Kitten and Fin 8, and Steve can talk more about those. But this one was pretty cool. I must say so myself.
Yeah, the level of coordination and just the technology deployed to do that, it's no easy feat. And when I speak with practitioners, a lot of times the perspective is that fraudsters are in this silo, that they are in some basement and they're just trying to do a chargeback or a return fraud. And that does happen. There are individuals that make fraud for a living. But when we think about the coordination of the organized crime groups, this is where the scale is much bigger. Some of those groups that you mentioned, there's a few others that I've been tracking, like Lazarus Group, which is linked to North Korea, Fancy Bear, which is another one related to the Scattered Spider Group. These are sometimes state-sponsored, sometimes rogue groups within other countries that are using VPNs or other technology to be right into our financial infrastructure. And they are doing these techniques with training. They're not just going about it ad hoc. They are educated in social engineering. They're educated in the latest and greatest technology. And they're also educated in legacy tech like knowledge-based authentication, where with the right data, they can exploit through. So I think we're going to continue to see more of these attacks because they work. There are weaknesses. And when you combine generative media, deep fakes with synthetic identity, now you're not impersonating leaders in a company, you're impersonating people that don't exist. And that is a phantom menace, not to use a Star Wars term, but that is a big threat that we have to combat.
You mentioned KBA just a moment ago, so I'd be remiss to not talk about the Chinese gang that we start here with. So literally in Texas, you can get yourself a new license ordered by simply answering KBA questions, knowing Steve's date of birth and address and driver's license number and certain pieces of data. Knowledge-based authentication is what KBA is. So a Chinese group decided to attack the state of Texas. They 4,000 times created fraudulent accounts or took over somebody's account and had replacement IDs sent 2,400 times. So this one's pretty scary in that, you know, we specialize in detecting those very sophisticated counterfeit IDs that aren't genuinely issued. But in this case, these documents were genuinely issued to, you know, probably bad people.
Right. Steve, you introduced
Am I still on video?
You're still on video. I see you. Thanks, Blair, for that.
Okay,
Steve,
good.
you introduced me to this term on our LinkedIn Live event a few weeks back, and it was KYF, Know Your Fraudsters. So this is a really crucial aspect to kind of combating fraud. Can you shed light on some of the tools and techniques that these fraudsters are using?
Yeah, most definitely. And I use that term because we often use KYC for Know Your Customer or KYB for Know Your Business. And it's really important to understand the personas and the motives and the different types of fraudsters you may encounter. And then in turn, the types of techniques they're using. So some of the most common we know, phishing. This is where they are sending emails that often look like they're coming from maybe it's Amazon or Facebook, in an attempt to trick the person into clicking the link, and then that goes to a page that's not really that property, and then they intercept credentials, which they use to log in and take control of the account. But there's also more sophisticated social engineering that comes into play We all get these notifications, text messages from our banks when they suspect fraud in a credit card transaction. The fraudsters realize that, and so they may send those alerts trying to spoof the financial institution in order to get a one-time password that was legitimately generated. And so you have multiple activities going on that can confuse the consumer into giving away that information. You combine that with deep fakes, you combine that with the ability to spoof phone numbers, and it's very hard to spot. They also are, as we mentioned, buying and selling personal data. So with data breaches, this data goes into the dark web, and these fraudsters are buying full stacks of personal information, and then they're using that to exploit KBA that we talked about. And then if you could exploit KBA, perhaps that gets you into a SIM swap scenario where you're using the cellular data. You've been able to switch that phone plan to a different phone, and now you get this SMS, which is the one-time password protection a lot of companies use, and then they can take over even more accounts. So these are very coordinated, very fast-moving activities that make it difficult for consumers to react to them.
Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I lost connectivity there for a moment. Sincere apologies, but have we talked about fraud as a service yet?
No, we didn't touch on that, so take it away.
This is an amazing thing. So this evolution of large language models has kind of changed the way everybody's thinking about generative AI and how it's going to eliminate jobs and how it can make everything so much easier for you to do whatever that task may be. And one of those tasks that people go to work for every single day is to commit fraud. So there has been Fraud GPT that has emerged. So instead of Chat GPT, we've now got Fraud GPT. And it will allow a novice the ability to do everything that Steve just described. If you want to mask your location, if you want a social engineer to perform a SIM swap, if you want to create a fake ID, if you want to generate a phishing campaign, there's this Fraud GPT service that for $150 a month you can subscribe to. And they don't just give you the tools, they also have the customer support center and mentors that guide you and walk you right through the service and how to perfect your attack. What's kind of interesting about Fraud GPT that I've discovered so far is most of the people that have subscribed to this service would never subscribe again and have canceled their subscriptions. The tools today, fortunately for us, are pretty nascent. They're not very sophisticated. The phishing attack scams that they create contain noticeable errors, but that's going to continue. So, you know, as these things continue to develop, it's up to people like Steve and I to stay a step ahead of them and thwart Fraud GPT and all the other attack vectors out there. I'm sure there will be plenty of others besides Fraud GPT that emerge.
Yeah, and one you alluded to earlier, Blair, around the was it OFX, the crypto around
OKX, yeah.
OKX, well, the only fake service that has emerged is now a tool that they're leveraging.
Yeah, and that's actually the tool that was used to perpetrate this crime. So we're talking about a very low cost. We're not talking about a sophisticated ID that you buy on the dark web. This is simply a really low cost, just a photo of an ID that generates fake text, fake photos of the you know, it's not a real person that's being generated and placed on the identity document. And they're like $15. But in our discovery so far, we've seen that there are plenty of mistakes that they make in generating these IDs, and a sophisticated company would be able to detect them pretty easily. A person, on the other hand, probably doesn't stand a chance. If you were doing manual review, and a lot of people still do manual review of identity documents, they're just emailed into a call center, and you're relying on people to detect the good and the bad, and you just don't stand a chance. I was fooled. Looking at these things online, I've created one of the only fakes, and if you look at it visually and don't really understand the underlying data that we're able to see, you know, it would absolutely fool a person. What about fake profiles, Steve? What have you seen those being used for?
Fake profiles, in many cases, they're long game activities that they are creating profiles that then build connections, and they're not immediately turning around and using those. Although that does happen too. I get a lot of LinkedIn messages from people with 2 connections asking to meet and give my personal information to them. But these profiles often get reviewed by these manual fraud teams. And if you go and look up and you see someone has a legitimate account on Facebook and they have a number of friends and connections, and you explore sort of the connections on the web of these profiles, you ultimately think, okay, this is a legitimate person. But again, it could just be a synthetic identity that's got a record in another credit bureau system that now can also have this fake ID. So, and these are completely made up individuals.
So these tools like
you said it. Yeah, go ahead, Christine.
I was going to ask if these tools like Fraud GPT and OnlyFake, are they accessible through the dark web, or can I just go on the internet and find them right now?
There's a wide variety of tools that are available without having to go to the dark web. With the dark web, you can get increasing sophistication, but there are plenty of tools that are advertised on everyday social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram, where they're recruiting, and you see these people that are boasting about the success of their crime, showing wads of cash and showing wads of treasury checks that they've intercepted and that they're selling, and wads of different fake IDs that they can sell you. So, there's plenty available without having to dig deep and be a dark web expert. What's your experience, Steve?
I'm finding that some of these tools that aren't labeled a fraud GPT or a worm GPT, that are just tools to be able to do AI actions, a lot of those get uploaded into GitHub repositories that are open sourced and downloadable. They're not advertised as being used for fraud, but someone who has nefarious intent could take that source, change things within it, and they're able to build their own systems and services without having to go to the dark web. And so I'm seeing more and more of that because everybody's trying to increase their contribution to the ecosystem. There's also a number of generative AI companies that are trying to fulfill purposes around generating copy or to support interactions, but because they're moving so quickly, they haven't thought through all of the guardrails and how their technology will be used to create these. And so you as a fraudster can also use legitimate services to commit these fraud attacks.
Like Adobe. It's been one of the most powerful photoshopping tools out there, and some of the tools that Adobe has created, if we don't have ethical use of those tools, can wreak havoc for sure.
Yeah, generative fill is a pretty amazing feature in Photoshop, but certainly that opens the door to a lot of other things that you can generate.
That's a pretty mainstream company, Christine. You don't need to go to the dark web to find them.
Yeah, I use Adobe, probably on a weekly basis in my team. All right, so let's move on to where fraud is happening. In our report, we cover this topic in a few ways. We talk about kind of geographic hotspots where we saw fraud rise domestically and abroad, but then we also talk about the uptick of fraud in certain industries and by channel. Can you guys touch on some of the biggest challenges that you've observed as it relates to these industries and channels?
Yeah, sure. So the fake IDs, as we can see here, the numbers your team produced, 83% of the fraud that we're seeing is based on a fake document. So the core business that we've started 10, 12 years ago is still pretty valid today. Obviously, they have gotten more sophisticated. Surprised to see the rise in biometric authentication where we're seeing fraud there. Again, I'll refer to my previous statement where fraudsters generally are reluctant to show their face on a camera. So for them to try to spoof it is pretty astounding. I'm guessing that a lot of these cases are where they've probably changed their face in some way, shape, or form, and the face that's on the identity document replicates how their changed face is. I doubt seriously that it's their real face. They're probably manipulating it in some way, shape, or form. But looking over to the left, I'll ask Steve this question. So which of those stats surprise you a bit in terms of increases in fraud by channel?
The biggest surprise for me, and as I understand this is external survey data, was the in-person attacks. Those are rising as you think there's more digital activity, that you'd see more in those other channels. So that was fairly surprising from the data to me.
Yeah, you would naturally think that the digital channel where, somebody isn't physically in front of you, where you could possibly get apprehended, would be the most attacked channel. I guess from our perspective, we've been working in brick and mortar with the telecommunications companies in North America now for many, many years. And we have seen how bold these folks are. They know their IDs are very sophisticated. They know that the people working in these stores don't really have the ability to look at an ID and know whether it's real or not. In fact, we saw, I think it was 200,000 more fake IDs presented primarily in brick and mortar stores in North American telecommunications companies just last year. It was approaching 1 million times that people physically walked in with fake IDs to a brick and mortar store with a fake document. I think the one that surprises me here the most is mobile apps. My understanding of mobile apps, we work with many of the top banks in the country, and their mobile apps are quite sophisticated. There are numerous controls built inside that mobile app. They know that the device hasn't been jailbroken. They know that where IP addresses you're normally coming in from. They know the UDID of the device. So to see a big rise in mobile app fraud, I'm scratching my head a little bit on that one. And customer service, I really would have thought that would have been the number one attack vector. It's completely faceless, pretty easy to socially engineer somebody on the other end of a phone. You can create urgency. They have babies crying in the background. There's lots of different techniques they do to create this urgency, to trick that customer service agent into helping you right now. So to see that only 41% of the time is a bit of a surprise, I think. Anything you'd like to add?
No, just to double click on the mobile side, why that didn't surprise me as much as I have seen a lot of effort to optimize workflows within companies, and that's part of the reduction in spend on acquiring new customers. And if you start to let your guard down in terms of where you do specific checks, there's always this balance between the level of security and the user experience. I could see that more fraud could find its way in. And then if companies aren't as sophisticated as using those techniques that you mentioned, they're going to be the weakest link in the fraud ecosystem. And again, fraudsters will advertise that, and you'll start to see pretty big increases until that hole can be filled.
You have pretty broad experience in the entire fraud ecosystem. So the online store and website fraud, how does that manifest, and what's their goal?
Well, generally, you're going to go to a web channel because it's much easier to script those interactions, to write automation, to be able to create profiles en masse. And you've seen companies emerge to detect those bots, and we've all filled out the CAPTCHAs. But then it's often harder to use some of the state of the art when it comes to capture workflow and computer vision. And that has advanced pretty rapidly, but certainly the experience via mobile channel is going to be more rock solid than with the online or the online store. So it naturally becomes a place that more attacks will occur.
In the online stores, is it fraudulent merchants, or are there online stores being scanned themselves?
Yeah, it's both. For a retailer who owns their ecosystem, these manifest into chargebacks or a return fraud. We get into the territory of first-party fraud, where it's really that person, but they're claiming it wasn't them. When you get into marketplaces where you have buyers and sellers, and sometimes those are individuals, sometimes it's business to business. If you're not properly verifying those, you can get into situations where it's fake goods, there are fake reviews, there are undelivered products, and there's often this challenge of foreign business entities setting up in those marketplaces, and knowing that if once they get banned, they can rejoin because they can create new accounts. And so we're seeing that certainly in the marketplace too.
I've seen an increase in the dark web, particularly where they've seeded businesses. So they have created EIN numbers with Social Security admin. They have LLCs established with states, and they've had these businesses created and paying their taxes for many years. And they're able to sell these seeded businesses for $400. Pretty inexpensive to be able to acquire a business that's been around for 3 years. And the damage that you can do there is pretty significant.
Yeah, and they use them for muling money as well. So maybe they don't manifest as a fraud loss, but they're moving dirty money from one spot to the other. The synthetic identities are also used for the same. So you might have synthetic identity accounts on your books, in your checking accounts, that don't ever present as an issue. And they're just a link in a chain that's a bigger problem.
Good point.
One of the pain points that is shared among financial institutions and some of the wireless providers that we talked about, kind of going back to the channel discussion, is that they're not really sharing data as it relates to their workflow verifications. Do you guys have any suggestions, like how businesses can create more of like an omni-channel approach to their verifications? Blair, something that comes to mind is maybe Fraud Shield and how you're kind of communicating internally within a company.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, this is a common pitfall that I see in working with practitioners, where the digital channel versus the in-store channel versus the contact center versus partner channels, they're all maybe unified and aligned from the front end because they have marketing programs that interconnect. But when you look in the back of the house operationally, they're not aligned. They have different practices for how they verify identities. They have different technologies in place. They have different budgets. And then sometimes conflicts of interest arise where maybe one team or department has more funds or budget than the other. Another department is understaffed. And that just is because there's not a cohesive strategy when it comes to those operations. So the best organizations from a best practice, they're thinking about their entire customer journeys, not just from the front end, but all the way through the back office systems, how they deal with escalations, how they deal with potential threats from account takeover, and how you reset your passwords and all those pieces, because the fraud will find a way. It's like water. It will pour through your environment until it finds the path of least resistance, and then it exploits it. And so you really have to keep an eye on that and track it.
I agree. And Christine, as you know, we work with really large enterprises, and I see this is really prevalent in many of these major enterprises. One side of the house has no idea that the fraud team or that the business side is trying to implement these new controls. So even within companies, we're not collaborating that well and getting uniform. But certainly as an industry and fighting the bad guys, we need to do more there. I thought this was a fascinating slide. If you want to go back for just a moment, across the top, you've got not all of, but many of the major fraud attacks. And at the bottom, you'll see some of the controls that you can put in place to stop the attacks. We won't go through these things in detail, but it's a pretty solid slide here. And if you look at how sophisticated some of the attacks may be, some of the technology that we're using to defeat those attacks is equally as sophisticated and in most cases more sophisticated. The last one that I'm seeing there is consortium data, and I can't wait for that to become a fruition.
All right, so I want to take a minute to do a polling question and get an idea of what the audience members, what are you using to fight fraud at your organization? So you can click on the polling section on the bottom right. And Blair, can you speak to this graphic here and just talk about some of the best practices and technology that we're using to help some of these fraud trends that we've been talking about today?
I'd be happy to. There's a ton here, and on each little rectangle, I could probably spend 30 minutes and elaborate because they're all very sophisticated algorithms that we've created over the years. But on the left side in the dark blue, you're going to see the things that we look at visually on an identity document. In the lighter blue on the right, you'll see things that we look at from a data standpoint. And believe it or not, they make tons of mistakes there. And then across the bottom, you'll see some of the tools and techniques that we use to make sure that the person, their biometrics and the way they're behaving is really the right person and the person depicted on the document. So we have controls and algorithms that prevent, the vast majority of the attack vectors that we see out there. We talked about headshot photo tampers earlier. Pretty prevalent, makes a lot of sense. Text tampering, material analysis, we see a ton of that. So many of these IDs are created digitally these days and have to be injected into the system via a screen or printed out. It used to be when we first started this business that most of the fake IDs that we saw were actually physical documents that people were ordering from a third world country. But that takes time. And it's risky. Those things may get intercepted. And what we're finding today is that the fraudsters need to act quickly on a data breach. A data breach happened yesterday. That data is still fresh. They want to act on that data today. And you can't do that if you're ordering a fake ID from a third world country. This is going to take weeks at best. So the digital IDs are absolutely on the rise. We see a fair amount of these shops like the only fake that you described earlier, where the signature that's on these documents is a font. It's not a real person's signature. So things like that we're able to detect visually. From a data standpoint, I talked about Adobe earlier. You can see that we do that XMP data check to make sure that the document wasn't just created totally in Adobe, but we check the EXIF data, which has date and time stamps on where those photos were actually taken. We look at the composition of the document numbers. We look at the composition of the barcode. We look at the composition of the document discriminator numbers. And most people think those are all just randomly generated numbers. They're not. There are algorithms behind those that generate those numbers, and very, very hard for a fraudster to figure out what that proper structure should be. And then going down to the behavioral and biometric standpoint, it's going to be really, really hard to spoof a company like AuthenticID with a generative AI created face. You have to be a live human taking a picture of yourself naturally captured at that point in time in order to be able to be matched to the identity document. That liveness detection tool is PAD 2 certified. So it's been tested by an independent third-party laboratory across hundreds of different attack vectors with a success rate of 0 in order to achieve that certification. But we're absolutely seeing a big rise in re-authentication down there front and center in the middle or in the bottom of this. So most of our customers, most of the breaches that we talked about earlier have to do with credential compromise. Well, if there isn't credentials to be compromised, then that crime is going to essentially go away. So the concept here is we're going to enroll Steve into a system and probably enroll his biometric modalities, his face and his voice. And the next time that Steve needs to log into our website, he doesn't need to log in with credentials. He can simply use his face or his voice, depending on the environment around you. So again, I won't go into deep detail on everything that's on this slide. That could take us forever. If anybody has any questions about any of those, please post them in the chat. Be happy to answer them and dig deeper.
Great. So let's see, time check. Let's do one more panel question and then we'll move on to Q&A. So let's talk about the evolution of the identity market. The Gartner releases something called their identity hype cycle that we follow really closely internally, and it talks about technology advancements and the projected peak of adoptions. Think about things like digital identity wallets, reusable credentials. So what aspects should we be contemplating for our fraud fighting strategy, our identity strategy now versus maybe things that we should take into consideration a year down the road? Any volunteers wants to take that one first?
Blair, maybe you kick us off.
Yeah, sure. So I just kind of touched on this a moment ago. So we have to get rid of passwords, folks. They just have to go. That no longer can be how you authenticate into any system. Those things can be socially engineered from you. A lot of people write them on Post-it notes. Most people don't have very good password hygiene, so they can be guessed based on things that you've posted on social media. It's just, it's got to go. So we have to move. We've seen the adoption of FIDO across every major operating system, which is biometric based and provides passkeys. So no longer using credentials. We're more of a believer here at AuthenticID in centralized biometrics because it can enable things like password resets and address changes and high risk things, or when somebody loses their device, this can become a problem with a FIDO based system. But at least start with FIDO. It's super easy to implement and start to mitigate some of the vulnerabilities that exist in your ecosystem today. So start there. The other one that's huge and has been, I think, for the past decade is behavioral, as you put up here. And the concept here is, we know how Steve interacts with his device. We know everywhere that Steve goes. We know how he walks. We know what pocket he puts his device in. So it's taking all that sensor data, accelerometer, gyroscope, compass, things like that, and identifying patterns of knowing who Steve really is. So if somehow I were able to get a hold of Steve's phone, I don't look like Steve. I don't look like Steve in the way that I walk, the way that I talk, the places that I go. And that different behavior is something that behavioral biometrics can really help prevent. And the beautiful thing about behavioral biometrics is that they're completely silent. The user doesn't have to interact. They don't have to do anything different than they normally do. It's pretty solid technology. Steve, you want to expand on either of those?
Well, I couldn't agree more about passwordless. That continues to be one of the biggest breach vectors because reuse of passwords is rampant. People use the same password on multiple accounts. And if a weak link in the chain, if those passwords get exposed, the first thing that the coordinated groups are doing is they're trying to do these credential stuffing activities where they're just trying everywhere they can to see if they can get in, and then they can take over the account. But that's challenging because remembering passwords is difficult. Some of the more educated consumers leverage password managers, but that's even not enough. Even the password manager companies have published that they've had breaches, and which has required changes in master passwords, et cetera. So definitely a big believer in the move to passwordless, but that's going to take time. And then on behavioral biometrics, it's a perfect fit for the mobile device that everyone already carries around with them everywhere they go. It starts to open the door to other use cases in the use of the login infrastructure. So some of the best organizations out there think holistically about first federating their entire identity. So no matter where you're coming from, whether it be through the website or walking into a store or using the mobile app, you could leverage that infrastructure to continuously verify that person when they're in an unusual spot, maybe from a location standpoint. Apple just recently deployed a feature in their latest operating system update where if you turn it on, if you try to change certain settings in the device, if you're not home, it puts a 1 hour timeout on it to prevent changes to the account when it's not there. So there's a lot of advancing technology to help continue to protect consumers.
I know we're getting close on time, but I just want to ask, why is it going to take a while for passwordless to take hold?
It's all about consumer behavior and value to the end user. And where these technologies, we know they're better. It's very challenging to get people to change their habits. And I've worked with individuals outside of the identity space who are still writing their passwords down in a book, or again, they're reusing them. So some of these leapfrog activities are going to take a lot of consumer education because it's the consumer use that drives the enterprise spend. So where the companies want to invest is going to be if the technologies are being used. When we look at changes in, say, like legislation, it's taken us over 20 years to get the Real ID Act that was passed in 2003 to fully permeate through all of our states, and we're still not quite there. So these things take time. I would hope for a faster adoption rate, but it's going to take more focused effort from the companies that are deploying these services to get their consumers to convert.
But it's not a technology issue, it's a consumer and education issue. Just
Exactly.
wanted to get that point out. Okay.
All right, so yeah, about 10 more minutes. Let's spend some time in Q&A. We have a few questions that came through. So the first question is from Ed. How do you see the trends towards mobile digital identity wallets, like the efforts from the European Union towards universal ID across member states? And how is user control of that data? How will that evolve? Anybody want to take a shot at that?
I think right now, adoption is super low everywhere. And we need to expand the utility of these digital wallets. Traditionally, they're being used for government services, for your pension, to take advantage of certain benefits that may exist, but you really can't go into a drugstore or a grocery store and use those digital wallets in most cases. So until we have more utility from the wallets, adoption will remain low. Is it the right way to go? 100%. Do I love the self-sovereign part of it? Absolutely. I should own my identity, not Target. The person that I'm checking out at doesn't need to know everything about me. They don't need to see what my address is and all the other details that are contained on an identity document. If I'm buying alcohol, they simply need to know that I'm 21. So I love the self-sovereign and the control of your identity data aspect of the wallets. Steve, anything to add?
We've certainly seen governments press on this path. Examples like the country of Estonia. The European Union is working on the framework for this electronic ID system. Canada, Australia, they all have initiatives. But it really does come down to the commercial sector and the individual interactions that are happening with the end consumer in that business. I actually, on this topic, feel that large companies like Apple or Google, or potentially Meta, could have a bigger role in getting reusable identity out, but it'll still be quite centralized through their services. But it'll get consumers comfortable with the idea that they, with just a few taps, can share specific information about their identity they want to, versus going through the process over and over again. But it's a much longer kind of adoption curve ahead for that technology.
I'm glad you mentioned Estonia. I happen to be friends with Mark Ehrlich, who is one of the creators of that Estonian digital ID system. And here's a real success story. They do have a benefit. There's only 1 million people in the country of Estonia, and they mandated that everybody in the country utilize this wallet. So that was, they absolutely had an inside advantage there. But today, last time I checked, they had over 2,800 different services that were plugged in to take advantage of that digital identity in Estonia. So I mentioned utility. In Estonia, there's a great amount of utility using that wallet. So there's a great example of this good success story.
All right, so another question that came through. In your opinion, are businesses gaining more comfort to adopt biometrics as a form of authentication for things like MFA or Step Up, or is the privacy concern still a really big deterrent to move to biometrics?
I'm mixed on this one, Steve, so I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I've seen a big change in sentiment towards biometric technology, specifically face. When I started in this space, many companies just wanted the document. They didn't want to deal with the extra step of capturing the biometric. Some of that was concerns around discrimination. Some of that was privacy. Some of it were just issues and unfamiliarity with the technology. But one of the big events that happened in the world was the adoption of the Face ID by Apple. Now, other providers had face solutions in the past. Samsung had it on its device for years, and Hewlett Packard, et cetera. But they really put focused effort in the hardware sensory to make sure the person was present, that they were live. And they also put a lot of effort into the matching technology. So now most consumers are familiar with that technology. Probably most people who get an iPhone or an Android device are using those technologies natively with the device. So it's opened up consumer behavior to do that within their financial institution or with some of the businesses that they do business with. But there is the flip side of that, which is ensuring privacy and security of that data. Some of the companies in the space have encountered the biometric laws in the state of Illinois that have private rights of action if there are violations to that. So there's certainly a cause and concern around that. But if you get the legal and the privacy side right, the use of biometrics is a powerful way to ensure that that person is really who they claim to be, and to do that in a seamless, ongoing way.
And to prevent the phishing. I couldn't agree with everything you said more, but I've been reading some articles lately where it's become challenging for people to recruit. If you make it a policy that you have to authenticate using a biometric onto our systems, I know people that have the Apple iPhone that have never turned on Face ID. They just don't feel comfortable doing that. So there is a portion of the population that will never believe that their face is going to be stored securely and won't be misused. So, it can be a deterrent to adoption as well. You've absolutely seen it.
Yeah, and there are plenty of individuals, I think, that don't want to password protect the device at all. There's no passcode, or there's a 4-digit passcode. And I think that's people's right to choose what type of security measures they put in place. But having awareness and education around the potential attack vectors, you may think, hey, I've already got my device always on me. I never had that scenario, but maybe your pocket is picked by a thief, or you get into a public setting where your device is stolen out of your hand, and without certain protections like those features, like you very, very quickly will probably change your mind in the future to put these protections in place for yourself.
Your bank account being drained will kind of promote action.
One more question I think we have time for that came through. It's from Rita. It says, we are seeing fraud in person, in the in-person channel, not necessarily as an ID theft, but setting up a legitimate account and using the account for online fraud activity. Any recommendations on combating that type of fraud?
Well, I think you need to do a better job underwriting that first mile. If you're opening up an account, you need to have trust in that account. And the only way to have trust is to know the identity of the person that you're interacting with. So somehow, some way, you've got to improve the identity, that whole process before you enroll and create accounts for people would be my first piece of advice.
Yeah, and if you're doing a proper identity verification process that's documented along the way, and those scenarios where that person later says, it wasn't me, and they were complicit to creating that account that was used for fraud, you then at least have recourse to say, well, here's all of our documented proof, the ID submitted, your face biometric, the IP address, all of the thing, maybe even a screen recording of the interaction. I think that puts you in a better position to retroactively pursue recourse there.
Okay, one more snuck in. How would we
right.
crack the deep fake CIO? What if I am in the meeting with the fake CIO? What questions should I ask to break the AI algorithm? We might need our data scientists for this one, but does anybody have any recommendations on that one?
I mean, questions, I don't know how it would help in this particular case, because you've got somebody speaking into a microphone, they're listening to the camera. When they speak into the microphone, it's coming out sounding just like the CFO. So, I know
detection.
Liveness detection would be super helpful. I think liveness detection in this case would have stopped it. We would have known that those were generated faces. And not real at that moment in time. So that would help. But running liveness detection on video is a little different than the way most people use liveness detection today. Steve?
Yeah, when that was being described, I was thinking about the time I worked in a bank, and we had a dual custody on the vault where you needed 2 keys to open the vault. So not just one person could go back there and take what they wanted out of it. And when I think about the modern analogy of that is if you have a deep fake CIO, you should have processes where it's not just a visual verification, but perhaps there is a second factor or multi-factor powered by a biometric to be able to prove that it's that individual. And perhaps you have that for both or multiple people, and be aware of these attacks. So I think there are solutions that exist today that can be applied as a process to prevent those, like the $25 million heist in the Hong Kong that you mentioned earlier, from actually going through.
Right. Well, I think that's a wrap. Anything else you want to, Blair? Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. Anything else you wanted
If
to
all
add?
3 signers that you've got in this policy, let's say you have to have 3 people sign off on it, and if all 3 people are in the room with the fake CIO, you kind of have implied consent there. So it's a challenge. This one is something we're going to all have to work on.
Thank you guys for your time today and your expertise, and thank you for everybody who tuned in. So keep an eye out on your inbox for the follow-up email, and until next time. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.